Look at these words. The word for mother in English, mother. In Latin, mater. In Hindi, mata. In Persian, mader. In German, muta. 5 languages, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, and the words sound almost identical. This is not a coincidence. It is a fingerprint, and it traces back to one language that was already ancient when Rome was still mud huts. Sanskrit didn't just influence the languages around it. It preserved the structure of a language so old that nobody alive has ever heard it spoken, and in doing so, it handed modern linguists the key to unlocking how half the world's languages are secretly related. This is the story of how one language built the foundations underneath languages spoken by 4 billion people and then stepped back from daily life without anyone fully noticing what it had left behind. Welcome to the Airlearn Language Show. This video is about a language that nobody speaks as a daily tongue anymore, and yet its fingerprints are on the words coming out of your mouth right now in English, whether you know it or not. It is the story of how one ancient language quietly built the foundations underneath half the world's languages, and then stepped back without anyone noticing. And I think it's one of the most remarkable stories we've covered on this channel. Speaking of languages, if you haven't checked out Airlearn yet, see what this person had to say about it. Link is in the description. Calcutta, 1786. A British judge named Sir William Jones is studying Sanskrit, not for any particular practical reason, but because he finds it extraordinary. And then he notices something that shouldn't be possible. Sanskrit's verb conjugations, its grammatical structure, its core vocabulary. All of it is too similar to Latin and Greek to be a coincidence. Not borrowed similarity, not the way English borrowed French words after 1066. Something deeper, structural. The bones of the languages matched. Jones delivers a lecture that year. In it, he states, Sanskrit bears a strong affinity to Latin and Greek than could possibly have been produced by accident, and that all three must have descended from a common source, which perhaps no longer exists. That single observation helped to launch modern comparative linguistics. Before Jones, nobody had a systematic framework for explaining why languages resemble each other. After Jones, scholars had a question that would drive a century of research. What was the common source? What was the original language that produced Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, Persian, German, English, and dozens of others? They call it Proto-Indo-European. Nobody has ever found a written record of it. It predates writing entirely spoken somewhere in the Eurasian steppe probably 6,000 years ago. It's a language reconstructed entirely from the fingerprints it left on its descendants. And the clearest, most legible fingerprint was Sanskrit. This is the question that matters. Latin was the language of the Roman Empire. Greek was the language of philosophy in the New Testament. Both were ancient, prestigious, carefully preserved. Why was Sanskrit the key? Because of Panini. Around 400 BCE, before Rome had built its empire, before Aristotle had written his philosophy, an Indian grammarian named Panini produced a complete formal description of Sanskrit called the Ashtadhyayi. Nearly 4,000 rules, organized with a precision and economy that Western linguistics would not match for over 2,000 years. Panini's grammar was not just a description of how Sanskrit worked. It was a formal system, almost algorithmic in structure. It described phonology, morphology, and syntax with the kind of rigor that modern computer scientists recognize immediately. When 20th century linguists started thinking about formal language systems, they essentially rediscovered what Panini had already built in 400 BCE. But Panini's work was only part of it. The other part was the oral tradition. Vedic priests memorized Sanskrit texts syllable by syllable, not word by word, syllable by syllable. The tradition included built-in error correction methods. Texts were memorized forwards, backwards, and in complex alternating patterns specifically designed to catch any drift from the original. The result is that Sanskrit pronunciation was kept virtually frozen for millennia. This oral tradition helped preserve very archaic features of the language, which made Sanskrit especially valuable to later linguists. This is why Sanskrit was the Rosetta Stone for reconstructing Proto-Indo-European. Latin had drifted, Greek had drifted, Sanskrit had been held still, deliberately, by people who understood that precision was sacred. Without it, the entire family tree connecting English to Hindi to Persian to Russian to Greek might have never been assembled. The obvious things first. The foundational texts of Hinduism, the Vedas, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, were composed in Sanskrit. The earliest Buddhist scripts were preserved in Pali, a close relative of Sanskrit, and much of Buddhist philosophical literature across Asia was written in Sanskrit itself. Two religions with a combined following of nearly 2 billion people traced their sacred literature back to this one language. Sanskrit was central to major religious, philosophical, and literary traditions across South Asia and beyond. Then there's mathematics. 0, not as a placeholder, but as an actual number with its own mathematical properties, was developed by Indian mathematicians working in Sanskrit. The decimal place value system, the concept that allowed humans to write any number with only 10 symbols. All of it originated in Sanskrit intellectual tradition and was transmitted to Europe through Arabic scholars. The floor underneath modern arithmetic, modern computing, and every piece of technology that depends on calculation laid in Sanskrit. Try doing calculus with Roman numerals. You can't. The system doesn't allow it. The system that does allow it came from India. And then there's the concept of grammar itself as a formal discipline. Before Panini, nobody had produced a systematic formal description of any language. Panini did it so completely, so rigorously, that it shaped not just how linguists think about language, but how computer scientists think about formal systems. The word Sanskrit itself means perfected or refined. It was designed to be a language of precision, and the discipline it generated outlasted the civilization that produced it. This is the part that sets Sanskrit apart from every other language on this list. Latin spread because Rome conquered. Arabic spread because Islam expanded. English spread because Britain colonized. Each of those languages had an army behind it. Sanskrit had none of that. No empire carried it. No military force imposed it. It spread through religious prestige, through trade, through the gravitational pull of an intellectual tradition so sophisticated that neighboring civilizations adopted it voluntarily. The reach was extraordinary. Sanskrit became the literary and ceremonial language across South Asia, Southeast Asia, and parts of Central Asia. The oldest inscription ever found in Southeast Asia is in Sanskrit, not in any local language. Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument on Earth, built in Cambodia in the 12th century, its inscriptions are in Sanskrit. The scripts of Thai, Khmer, Javanese, Tibetan, and dozens of other languages were either derived from Sanskrit scripts or deeply shaped by Sanskrit vocabulary. A language spoken natively in northern India left its fingerprints on the writing systems of Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, and Tibet, not through conquest, but through cultural gravity. People chose Sanskrit because it represented something they wanted to be a part of. That is a different kind of power than empire, and in some ways, a more durable one. Sanskrit was always primarily a language of scholars, priests, and literature, not of common people. Alongside it, ordinary spoken languages were evolving continuously. These were the Prakrits, the everyday tongues that Sanskrit's formal tradition coexisted with for centuries. Over time, the Prakrits became what we now call Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, Gujarati, Punjabi. Sanskrit became increasingly ceremonial, more rarefied, more precise, more preserved, and more distant from daily life. By the medieval period, Sanskrit was doing what Latin was doing in Europe, functioning as the language of scholarship and religion, understood by the educated and the priestly, while everyone else spoke something derived from it. Today, fewer than 25,000 people claim Sanskrit as a first language. India has made attempts to revive it. University programs, government-funded initiatives. Whether a language this precisely preserved frozen, almost deliberately, at a specific point in its development, can be thought back into a living daily tongue is one of the more interesting open questions in modern linguistics. Revival efforts exist, but Sanskrit remains far more common as a ceremonial and scholarly language than as a native home language. Sanskrit didn't conquer, it didn't colonize, it refined itself so precisely that it became the measuring stick against which every language it touched was eventually compared. It gave the world zero. It gave the world formal grammar. It gave the world two of its major religions. And it gave linguists the key to understanding how 4 billion people ended up speaking related languages without knowing it. Here's the thing that stays with me. Latin is dead in the sense that it transformed. It became French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian. Latin is alive in its descendants. Sanskrit is different. Sanskrit's direct descendants, Hindi, Bengali, the modern Indo-Aryan languages, are very much alive. But Sanskrit itself didn't transform into them the way Latin transformed. It stepped back. It let the spoken languages evolve around it while it stayed still, preserved, watching. The children grew up and moved away, and Sanskrit stayed exactly where it was, still there, still perfectly preserved. Still the clearest window we have into a language nobody has spoken for 6,000 years. Everything those 4 billion people say still has its fingerprints on it. They just don't know it yet. If this video sent you down a rabbit hole into the Indo-European language family, which it should, Airlearn is a great place to go next. Pick any language on the family tree, and you'll find Sanskrit's fingerprints in there somewhere. Links in the description. See you in the next one.